Another interesting thing here is something called the control paradox. As soon as you try to control the outcome, you will start to lose control over the outcome.
So welcome to the next episode of the Megadeals podcast. And we're really excited about our guest today because he is going to talk about something that we don't address in the Megadeals book. In the Megadeals book, we are talking about how you orchestrate large, complex deals. But another important element of doing these type of deals is, how you negotiate and how you drive dialogue techniques with the actual stakeholders you meet. And the gentleman that we have today is an expert, extremely experienced in how to negotiate. And we're so happy to have you on the podcast, Johan Lagerbielke. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. And of course, we have Christopher as well today.
Yes.
So Christopher and me will be your hosts, and we're really looking forward to the next 45 minutes or so to kind of tank your brain on negotiations and complex negotiations. So before we start, why don't you tell us just briefly about you, but also how did you kind of get into this arena of negotiations?
I was a student at Stockholm School of Economics and took an MBA there in the late 80s. And after that, I read psychology. And I wrote my thesis in psychology about negotiations. And by a coincidence, I come across a man, Erik Runesson, who is now a judge in the Swedish Supreme Court. And he had been at Harvard University and attended a course in negotiation. He was very excited about this. So he had started a course at Juristlinjen at the Stockholm University in negotiations. And then I found out, well, this is very interesting. So I went to...
because at that point in time, it was kind of an unexplored.
Yeah, totally unexplored.
Very much street fighting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was sort of... So I went to a professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in economic psychology, which I thought was the sort of subject closest to this. And asked if I could start work there. And he said yes, and then I started a course together with this man, Erik Runesson. And that was the first course in Sweden at the sort of business administration program. So I was a pioneer in a sense. And it wasn't very many courses in other parts of the world either then at the time, but that developed very, very fast during the 90s. So that was very fun.
Great.
And the first courses I had at Stockholm School of Economics, I was sort of, I brought along a lot of practitioners, and it was good to be
as guests.
As guests, exactly. Yeah. They talked about purchasing or the Swedish membership negotiations for the European Union or hostage negotiation. Very different kind of negotiations. Very fun, and sort of gave me a lot of insight still to what sort of how negotiations could differ. And what's sort of essential in different kind of negotiations. And since 1999, I work as a consultant and as a sort of trainer in negotiations. So I've done that for 4 companies. I've done that for almost 20 years now. So that's a little of my background.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So why don't you share with us, I mean, you obviously, you've got a lot of knowledge around this, you've done this, you teach this. What are the kind of key elements? What are the most important elements of a successful negotiation?
And particularly connected to Megadeals.
To Megadeals, okay.
Yeah.
If we start at a general level, you have sort of 3 cornerstones in every negotiation. And the first cornerstone is the alternatives. What will people do if they don't reach an agreement? And if you have a mega deal, well, that cornerstone is in the absolute beginning. You have to understand if the customer is willing to buy it But as soon as sort of the process have started, the buyer don't have that many alternative, maybe one or two, but not more than that. So, but you always have to have that in mind. What is the alternative for us? What is the alternative for the buyers? And I think that's important for the sellers too, because one common thing that I come across here is that at the seller side, you have a marketing department or a sales department, and then you have sort of the person who's going to deliver the thing. And the seller, they sell it, and then they send sort of, we have sold this, and the producer got it, and they say that well this is absolutely too cheap. We can't produce that this cost. It's impossible. What are you thinking with? And they are very happy just for selling it. And so I've made a lot of this kind of negotiations when you have sold something too cheap to someone and you want to renegotiate it. And that's a very tough negotiation.
That's very common in Megadeals.
Yeah, that's extremely common. I think in all deals. Yeah. And the biggest problem here, what I come across, is not a counterpart. It's your own organization. Right. Because if you have sold something, everyone is satisfied with that. So they think that, well, this is so great. We have sold it. Don't destroy it now. Right. But we're losing money on it. Well, it doesn't matter. Right. We sold it.
And it's also on the customer side a scope creep quite often.
Yeah.
Because that's something we've seen also, not just around negotiations around Megadeals, but the whole perspective on Megadeals, that the deals are so complex, and typically the corporation is covering 5, 10, 15 years. And over that time period, quite a lot of changes are happening. And all of a sudden, the initial contract isn't covering it. We've talked a lot about how the value system, corporate values on one side they have to match the buyer corporate values, for example, but also connected to the actual contracts and the negotiation. So many things are happening that you're bound to renegotiate. And it's not that anyone is evil. It's just the nature of it.
No, I think that's a very important thing too. Sort of a bit away from this, but to have the possibility to renegotiate things. That's I think even the party who sort of seems to win on the changes will lose in the end if you don't renegotiate things. So that's a very important thing. And I think what surprises me here is that I think the biggest problem when you should renegotiate thing is most of the time in your own organization. Because I think having big customers gives you a lot of prestige in your organization, because that's where the money comes from. So the people closest to the customer don't want to challenge them. So you have to find ways and be open to talk about what is, because it's very easy that it will be a sort of a political game in your own organization here.
Right.
And the person who mentioned the problem that we're losing money on this deal they will focus on that person instead of the problem.
Right.
The second cornerstone is legitimacy. What's right? What's right and just in negotiation? And the best thing to do this is using something called objective criteria. You have reason for why you come to a certain conclusion, and you share those reasons. And just by sharing the reason, you're setting the stage in a sense, because it's very hard for someone else to come up with other reasons, or maybe they can, but even if they do, you will still set, and this is called the anchoring mechanism. The person who first mentioned a reason, a figure, an idea will anchoring the scene. So that's a great thing to do.
You try to do that first.
Yeah, all the time, if you can. But when it comes to selling services, you have to be a bit careful here, because it's not, and when it's to complex deals too, because you don't exactly know the value for the buyers, how valuable these things are. So if you give, for example, a too high a price too early, you can, scare them away, because they can't see the value in it.
Right.
So you have to set the scene in a sense. You have to ask questions and make them understand what the value is before you give the first offer, the first bid. So that's. But when it comes to things that people sort of immediately understand, then it's always better to start.
And you're so right, because one of the hardest things, and I remember when I started my career at American Express, it's because the customer wants you to talk about the price as quickly as possible, right?
Yes.
But your job is to talk about it as late as possible because you want to keep building that value.
Yeah.
And that, there's always this kind of tug of war between you and the client because the second you talk about price too early, you're in trouble because you haven't built the underlying value.
No, one way to see it is that first you have a sales process. You're selling something. And as soon as you have some kind of buying signal or something, sort of an indication that the buyer want to buy, then you're coming into negotiation mode. But if you start to negotiate before they even are interested in buying it, they will sort of it will just seem unpolite and rude to. So I think legitimacy is one thing, and the most common mistake people do when it comes to legitimacy is that they try to convince other people about things.
I love this point. Talk more about this. You made this point in your podcast, and I think you're so right.
And I think I don't know where they get it. I think it's very intuitive to try to do that, and rhetorics is exactly the same idea. You sort of have the best argument, and you should win, and you should convince them. But my experience is that you won't convince anyone about anything that is against that person's interest. It's almost impossible. But you could still set the stage. And I think the most efficient way is to work the other way around, setting the stage and then letting them convince you. Here we're reaching another thing. Most people want to be smart and come up with a solution. This is exactly what I'm doing here. But it's in our genes to do that. But hold back the solution. You have to have the solution, and I think experienced salespeople know that it's much better to ask a lot of questions. There's a lot of sales technique that work exactly that way.
And nudge the client to come up with the solution.
You ask a lot of questions and nudge the clients to come up with the solution. And because then you both have a commitment, you have a satisfied client, you have all those things. If you push something on someone, they won't feel the commitment, they will forget about it, they will sort of felt run over, so they won't like it.
I think that's such an important point. I mean, the difference between preaching and actually asking clever question that gets the client to get to the solution themselves, and then the client feels it's their solution and they're committed. Right.
And this is the most common thing I come across as a consultant when I'm trying to help the people to negotiate. They always do this mistake. I tell them sort of, okay, don't come up with any solution, or if you do, please don't present them to the counterpart. Well, and the only thing they ask me, well, I have a great idea. Do you think we could suggest this? Could this be a way forward? Yeah, maybe, but don't mention it. And then they call back and say, well, I suggested that. Well, that was exactly what you shouldn't do. And I think that's one of the big problems when it comes to coaching people in negotiation. They don't do as I tell them.
Right.
Yeah.
Because intuitively they will do. They will think with their spine and do things, and normally those things are wrong.
I'd love to get your advice on this, Johan. But the other thing, one of the things we did a lot at Amex when we were doing negotiations was when you start coming from your own opinion, you end up negotiating on positions, right? Because this is my position, this is your position, rather than negotiating on interests, right?
Exactly.
And that's such an easy way to fall into that. If you start telling them, hey, this is what we do, then they go, no, this is what we do. No, this is what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And as soon as you get a position, you will the people will lock into or dig into their positions. That will happen immediately. But I think, and I've thought of this. I never done it, in fact. But maybe you should have a contract if you're coaching someone, and please do as we tell you. Don't do anything else, because what it was interesting with negotiation is that you normally don't get any feedback on your behavior, and when you don't get, and the feedback you get on your behavior is, if you get any, it's probably not accurate at all. So it's very hard to learn. And I think that was one of the most thrilling thing about doing research about negotiation, to understand what is it that works and what doesn't work. And this is one of the absolutely most common mistake people do. And they won't learn either. And that's interesting because you don't get the feedback.
This is why it's important to blend science with practice.
Yeah, exactly. And here's, especially in negotiation, I think science have a lot to contribute with. Okay. That was legitimacy. Could I talk about the last point you mentioned here was the interest, the party's interest. What are the party interested in? And the most common mistake we do here is that we think that we have opposite interests. Another very common thing is that we think that the counterpart has sort of is a monolithic unity. They have exactly the same interest, whereas in an organization there's a lot of interest, a lot of things going on.
And the clear example is: do you have any kind of internal politics in your organization? If the answer is yes, and it's yes for everyone, then you realize that the buyers are having different interests as well, different agendas. I mean, I've some people you meet, they want to buy because it improves the financials. Some people want to buy from you because it helps their career. I mean, there's so many different agendas.
When it comes to project negotiations, when you want to push through projects in an organization, for example, or with organizations, I think one of the most interesting things to understand here is that in which way do people work? You probably remember vector in your physics in school. And I think everyone has a vector. They're sort of working in a certain direction.
Yes.
And you have to find out which people are working in the same direction as you.
Right.
Because these are natural allies. And it's a lot of people who are working in other directions, and they're not your allies.
Right.
And when it comes to sort of traditional sales negotiation, in Megadeals you are using a word, the Trojan horse, or the informer, someone who could give you information about what's going on in the
behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, exactly, because you will never there's no other way to figure it out.
Right.
And if you have doing assumptions or something, you're always wrong.
Right. And it's interesting you bring that up. I mean, what we found in the research is actually, without exception, all Megadealers agree to, if they don't have one or sometimes even a few Trojan horses on the buying side, they will never win, because it's absolutely impossible. And the only thing you can know if that is the case is that your competitor is having them.
Yeah.
So then you're screwed.
Yeah.
And without those kind of insights, you're gone.
So, Johan, thanks for walking us through those three cornerstones. Do you have, from experience, an example that you can bring this to life?
Yeah, I'll give you an example, a big deal. It was an insurance company that had bought an IT system of a company, and the seller, they lost a lot of money on this deal.
So they sold it too cheap.
Yeah, they sold it absolutely too cheap.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they both sold it too cheap, and they over-delivered. Okay. And
so the deal P&L was horrible.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
And no one really knew about this. And then the management sort of, they looked through all these they have and found out that this was sort of the absolutely most sort of red alert deal of all of them, and they wanted to renegotiate them. But what happened then was that when they approached the buyer and told them that we want to renegotiate this because we're losing a lot of money on it, and the buyer said, we have a contract, we can't see the problem. Everything works great for us. Okay, so
I think we've all been there some point in our lives.
Yeah,
it's a horrible situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's a horrible situation. So what we have to look at there was to have to look at what are their interests. Well, their prime interest was that things will work. From the purchasing department's sort of perspective, their prime interest was that bring down costs, and they didn't really care about if things worked or not. But sort of the producing department in the insurance company, for them this system must work. So what we tried to do here, it was try to sort of build an alternative for them. It's called a VATNA, worst alternative to negotiate the agreement. Something sort of terrible will happen if you don't renegotiate with us.
Right.
And
instead of a BATNA.
Exactly. Instead of a BATNA, best alternative to negotiate agreement. So what we told the production department here was that, well, stop over-delivering, because otherwise we don't have anything to negotiate.
Yeah, we have no position to
we have
negotiate
no position at all.
Everything's working and they're paying
exactly.
zilch. So
exactly.
Yeah,
what happened then was that the marketing side and the production side said, no, we don't want to. We want to continue over delivery. We want to have satisfied customers. We can't do this. This is totally against everything we stand for. And sort of a political turmoil in the selling organization. But we managed to get them to stop over deliver. And after a couple of weeks, when we get them to stop over deliver, sort of the production side on the insurance company sort of found out that things didn't work as smooth as they used to, and they started to get a problem. And then they wanted to renegotiate. But the purchasing department says, well, we don't want to renegotiate anything still. And so the pressure had to sort of build up in the buyer organization. And it took maybe a month or 1.5 months before it did. And then they came back and started to were open to renegotiate.
Then purchasing was also on board.
Exactly. And what happened there was that we first met the purchasing guys, but we had already made the analysis that those purchasing guys, they had nothing to contribute in this deal because they were the guys, they didn't know exactly, they didn't know what this was about at all. Right. So the only thing they know was that they
keep down costs.
Down costs. So we refused to negotiate with them. And we got a deadlock. And what happened then was that they brought along some sort of a boss from a manager, a manager higher up in the organization. And my side, the computer consultancy firm, they want to come with suggestions all the time. Couldn't we suggest this? Or couldn't we do this? And I just told them, don't suggest anything at all. And we waited and waited, and finally, their manager came with a suggestion. Could this be a way forward? And this was sort of nothing new or nothing sort of that we haven't thought of, but we let them come with it. And as soon as he came,
it was an expected suggestion.
We just held back, and as soon as he came with it, we said, "Well, you got a point. We haven't really thought about it in this way, but that's an interesting point." And the figures you mentioned, we can't really accept them, but the ideas here, I think, as you're into something. Let's come back on that one. And what's happening then is, as soon as he has suggested something, a psychological mechanism called consistency will start to work.
Yes.
He will act in accordance with his own suggestion.
Of course.
Yeah. People don't want to come across as irrational.
Exactly.
I'm a rational person. I'm consistent with my opinions.
Exactly. So, especially if he has suggested it, he had written mails about it. So sort of we have all the documentation, and then we could find a solution sort of built on what he has suggested.
Right.
But if we had suggested anything at that point, it never worked.
Right.
So the lesson from this was that don't come with suggestions, and most of the time your own organizations will also have different interests.
Right.
So you have to understand the interest in your organization and in their organization.
This is a really great example, Johan. Thank you. And apart from the technique and strategy of how to negotiate around interests, and I love the piece about holding off, because it's, if you're a bit junior, you have this kind of irrational urge to kind of get in there, but just this kind of just stand off and wait. And handling the unknown, you're kind of out of your comfort zone. But it's so important to know when to do that. Yeah,
handling the unknown. That's called. It was a very famous psychologist, Fritz Perls. He was a founder of Gestalt psychology, and he had a saying that was, "Trust the process." If you know that the process is going in the right direction, and it's some key points to know if things going in the right direction or not. But I'm going to talk about them now. But if you know that things go in the right direction, just trust it. Don't push it. He had another saying that is, you can't push a river. You can't push someone to something. You have to trust it, and you have to be sort of comfortable in just sort of being in what's happening.
Yeah,
right.
And I think another interesting thing here is something called the control paradox. As soon as you try to control the outcome, you will start to lose control over the outcome.
For me, there are two really important things to take away from this example. One of them is the the way that you plan and strategize the negotiation.
Yeah.
But I think the other piece that we shouldn't forget, and I think it's very typical for Megadeals, is how you're also understanding the ecosystem and how to play that ecosystem, right? Because you're talking
multiple parties.
Exactly, because it's not just about the negotiation strategy, but you need to understand in a whole point about procurement versus production, versus all
external
the different
consultants.
Exactly, because
other
to your point,
system
you
vendors
understood
in this
whose
case.
needs is what, and you were playing them off each other, right? Is also, and I think the more complex the deal, the more the ecosystem understanding and the understanding of the different players in the ecosystem becomes really, really important.
And I think if you negotiate projects, then you can often ask the stakeholders, this different people, what's interesting for you? Why are you working on this? What's your motivation? Why? Okay, well, we were going to try to take that into consideration,
right? And
also let them build projects to work in a certain direction, because then they will become much more motivated. They will but when he's selling things, I think that could be in Megadeals that could be tough, but still asking people,
absolutely. But understanding. I mean, I've been doing a lot of these deals, but to your point, procurement is about costs, production's about delivery. So it's the same thing when you have multiple functions that you're trying to influence. So there's compliance, there is sales, there is marketing, and then there's different levels in the organization, etc. They all have different interests, and you need to understand them.
And I think in Megadeals, you have two different situations. One situation is that the buyer wants to buy a certain sort of service or product system or whatever, something, and they have sort of contacted some suppliers about could you sort of sell this to us? This is the first situation, and there the information could be a bit harder to get. And then you have the situation where you are approaching the buyer and say that, well, this could be a project that we could build together. And then you have much more open then it's much more legitimate to ask people in the buyer organization what's important for you, and build projects together with them.
Build trust.
Exactly. And work in a way that you got a lot of allies in the buying organization.
I'm very curious about something that I often end up in when doing both Megadeals, but also when doing more medium-sized deals of a more strategic character, and that is the price competition at the end. So even though you follow the messaging architecture, you've been able to disqualify cases, position competitors out, etc., you often end up with two different challenges at the very end of the process. One is that the customer is saying, we cannot spend more than X. And the other one is that you actually have a competitor Y here that are offering us a price that is half yours. And I find that in those situations, I'm a bit without tools, without methods. And so I'm personally very curious about your take on that, Johan.
Yeah. The first thing is that if you're on the purchasing side, the absolutely easiest method to negotiate is just to tell your suppliers you have to go, well, everything is perfect, everything is great, but we are under a lot of pressure and you have to go down on
below
price.
X.
Exactly, below X on price. It's so easy. You have to go down 5%, whatever. You just and you almost always get something if you do it.
Yeah.
And I think the way to handle that one is to have some kind of reason why you get why you should be paid what you're being paid, or point at some agreement which you have already made with the customer about that we have set this stage and that they shouldn't be able to renegotiate it. So you should, when you come to a deal, you tell them that, well, it's we can renegotiate other things, but not price. Is that okay with you? Because and then you could go back and point at that.
Right.
How to handle it? Maybe you could sort of give in a little,
right?
Yeah, just to give them something. But then you have the smart thing is to take height on that at the beginning.
One guy that inspired me a lot is a guy called Todd Capone. He's based in Chicago.
Yeah.
Kind of sounds like a relative to Al Capone, but
it's not.
But it's not. He's talking a lot about transparency, and he was driving growth at, I think it was Exact Target over many years when he ran sales and marketing. And one of the things he taught his salespeople was to so if you have a lot of levers, let's say in your offering, there are 5 dimensions of the price. One is per user, one is per volume, one is per XYZ.
Yeah.
So what he preaches is that you're transparent about these, and then you ask the client. So, and also kind of payment terms, paying everything up front, spread out, all these kind of things. So what his recommendation is to open up the box and talk about all these levers, and let the customers talk about which of them are easiest to deal with. So, and if they decrease one, then boom, one goes up. So he said, don't negotiate. Just give the customer the playing field to negotiate for themselves. I mean, I'm not sure if that is a good one. I want to hear it.
Yeah, I think what a customer always do is that they try to put, especially the purchasing department, they always try to push on price because it's nothing wrong. It could never be wrong. But if they start to push on other things, they could start to make mistakes. So they will always try to push on price, even though price is not it could be not even the main interest. But it's so you have to understand the counterpart's interest. What are the buyer's real interest? And made the analysis, is this really in accordance with their interest? And another thing that you should ask yourself is that if they have a competitor that is so great as they say, how come they're sitting here in the first place?
Right.
And if they use you as some kind of benchmark, I think you should sort of mention that. Stating the obvious. I got the impression that you are using us as some kind of benchmark.
We're just a shadow offering.
A shadow offering, exactly. So to push someone else. And that's not the way we work. So we want a commitment from you. I understand that you want a commitment from us, but I think mentioning what's a lot of people, if you got a feeling, for example, you shouldn't hesitate to mention it, but most people do because they think it's very inconvenient to do it.
Right.
And you also think that you hurt your relationship or something like that. This is called meta communication, and it's talking about what's really going on.
Right.
And I think this is very efficient because you put yourself in respect. And the other thing that you do is, which is, I think it's a bit counterintuitive, that you get a better relationship, in fact. Because if you have tough talk with someone, the interesting thing is that you have to be more open to one another. And with openness comes trust.
And respect.
And respect. So I think mentioning mentioning what's going on. Exactly.
Right.
I think for them to change in a late stage, for the buyer to change direction in a late stage of the negotiation, is very, very hard.
Right.
It's almost impossible.
So what I interpret here is something I've done successfully is to. So when sitting with purchasing, I know that the business part of the organization, they've bought into the scope. They have locked down, they've anchored on the scope. So when talking to purchasing and they want to reduce the price, when I start to move items out of the scope, I say, okay, I mean, it is correctly priced on this scope, but we can reduce the price by excluding things. Then they become very uncomfortable, and they're like,
that's a good day to work, a good way to work.
Right.
And another thing is deadlocks. The way to a deadlock is always the same trip. You always have deadlock almost always around price. But as soon as you have other questions, that you have a package, as you illustrate here, it's very hard to deadlock a negotiation if you have a package, because then you could always
different levers to pull.
Exactly. You could always sort of push some. So I think sort of you should never leave price alone at the end of the negotiation.
Right. I have a similar experience. So in the contract, so you're going through paragraph by paragraph, but you say, okay, I hear you on paragraph 5. I hear you. I've taken notes on that, but let's not lock it down yet. I've understood what you want. And let's look at the big picture when we've gone through everything. Right? Is that in line with
that's exactly in line.
Right.
And with lawyers, for example, they love to take one paragraph at a time and work
tick
things.
The boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Tick the boxes and work through the contract.
Yeah.
But doing that, it's very easy to end up with the toughest question at the end.
Right.
So keep things open.
Right.
But this is very much against our sort of instinct to.
Yeah, we want to tick boxes.
Exactly, we want to control things.
Yeah. We want to tick the to-do list.
Exactly.
Tick.
Yeah.
So in negotiations, you have to have a bit of this let go attitude.
Yeah. No prestige.
Exactly. And what I've seen is that you have two kind of negotiators: the well prepared, but they are control minds. And they will try to control the outcome too in negotiations. Right. They're great when they prepare, but they're bad when they negotiate. Right. And then you have the other kind, which are sort of happy-go-lucky ones. They haven't prepared anything, but they're very good in the sort of in the process because they are sort of they're comfortable with not knowing where things going.
Right. I actually have a negotiation that's pretty recent where we created a joint venture with the larger company. For a certain region where I was the more kind of easygoing type in the setting, and the CEO, so I'm a board member in this company, and the CEO he's very diligent, super well prepared. He's actually an ex-lawyer to be
okay.
But we had a great team play because I could be more holistically moving around, and he was the one that had thought through every paragraph and what the consequences were.
Yeah,
that was a great team.
That's the perfect thing. Yeah, you need both those roles. Yeah, and it's almost always very hard to find them in the same person.
Right. Yeah, because of different personalities.
Yeah, different. We have different personalities, and sort of what I've seen in personalities is that it's very, very uncommon that you have both those, and just admit that you don't have both.
Right. Yeah, which is fine.
And I think it's for people to admit that I'm a social guy, I'm not very structured, or that's great. But for the structured guy to admit that I'm a structured guy and I'm not very social, and I'm sort of it's much tougher.
Right. So I have nowhere near your background, Johan, on this area. So, but it's fun to throw up some situations I've been through and hear your kind of more structured and scientific approach to it. So, one thing that have worked well in the past for me in a negotiation is to have not only these different roles in the actual negotiation, but also have kind of a mapping between the hierarchies. So, in another situation, I had the direct link to the group CEO of a company. I had other people underneath doing the actual negotiation, but I was continuously over a few months talking to the group CEO to get his perspective on it, and we kind of had another discussion, and we were both convinced and very open about that we wanted this to happen, and this was kind of a channel. So he knew that what he told me would, in some form or another, reach the negotiator group on my side, but sometimes he could also be delivering criticism. He could say, well, your guys in this situation, this is what they do. We don't like that. So he could also deliver pretty frank and direct negative feedback. And that was working, that kind of hierarchical mapping.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no scientific proof of this, but this is something.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of different roles. I think those roles are normally called you are in this case you are the relationship builder.
Yep.
You keep a good relationship to the customer all the time, and you don't work with the nitty-gritty things, because as soon as you start to argue with the customer, you could start to create something called cognitive dissonance. If you have another opinion than they have, they will start to dislike you a bit.
Yeah.
So, okay. To a certain extent, you can have different, but don't argue. Yes, sort of, and that's what you're doing here, the relationship builder. Yeah. The other people,
there were situations during this negotiation where he called me up and he was furious. He was super angry, not at me, but and that's frustrated about the situation not moving fast enough. But he could ventilate that with me,
Yeah.
And I kept the relationship intact and brought it back
And it's
into
also key from an
calm
escalation
terms.
standpoint,
Yeah,
because you need an
exactly.
escalation
And,
standpoint.
Those other guys are called cost cutters, people that negotiate nitty-gritty things.
Right.
And there you will have a lot of conflict. But you can come from above and sort of change things here.
Right.
This is one of the reasons too that negotiators should never be managers, and managers should never be negotiators.
Right. So what do you do then?
Yeah, you let someone else negotiate.
And you stand
Exactly.
above that or beside
And
that.
I've seen this so many times because the manager,
Great point, yeah.
the manager or the CEO, or he's not very well prepared, so he don't know exactly what about things. He don't think things are so. No, he's used with a lot of money, so he don't care about small sums, and he want to get things done as fast as possible. So he want to push things through.
Yeah. And understand that sometimes speed is more important than details.
Exactly. And probably he sort of have a very booked agenda. So for him it is. But so don't let your boss on your side or the manager or CEO on your side negotiate. But if their CEO want to negotiate, that's great.
Why?
Because he will push things through.
Okay, so you will quickly be frustrated and
exactly.
move on.
So the higher up,
Right.
you could get someone from the other side as a negotiator.
You shouldn't do the same on your side.
Yeah, you shouldn't do the same on your side.
Which is, at least in my experience, that is uncommon. So most people are throwing in the bosses in the negotiation.
Exactly. You could frame the bosses. That's another role. That's called the sales role. Why should the boss come? The boss should come there to describe things, to make the customer feel that they are very important, that this is very sort of, this is the most high. Exactly. This is the highest priority for us.
Yeah.
And one example of this is that sort of, for example, when I left Handels, a lot of my classmates there, they went to different kind of investment banks.
Right.
And those investment banks, they have a very fun strategy when it comes to sell sort of their projects to Swedish companies. They sent some Americans with very, very deep voices, would fly in from New York or from London, and they talked to those Swedish guys, and then they left. And they had nothing to do with the project after that. And then it was my sort of former classmates that made all the work.
Right.
So they were just there to sell the project.
And to show priority.
Show priority, sell the project. And I think people also buy because it's fun.
Oh, yeah.
They want to meet someone interesting, someone
who
who they can talk
the
about.
Group CEO from this large company coming in, and that's
someone who they can talk to, which I sort of, they want to feel VIP themselves.
Right. And I normally see that person in the newspaper.
Exactly.
I never meet them.
Exactly, I never meet them. Exactly. So, and I think an interesting thing. I once had lunch with the German ambassador in Sweden, and before he was the German ambassador in Sweden, he has organized Germany's state visits.
Right.
And he was very jealous about Sweden because we have royals. Because
they don't have royalties in
exactly,
Germany. Right?
Exactly. And everyone thought it was fun to meet a king or a queen. But to meet the German president, most people think that, there's nothing to sort of tell my grandkids that, I met the German president.
Right.
Well, it's great. But
And large Swedish companies are using the Swedish royalties, both the Jaws, Ericsson, they're using royalties now and then.
And that's the sales role.
Yeah.
Okay, so conversation is brilliant. I mean, it's really, I think these discussions is really bringing the whole discipline of negotiations to life.
And a heads up, we'll run a webinar on Megadeals negotiations as well.
Absolutely.
With us, together with Johan.
Absolutely. Coming soon.
Yeah.
Coming soon. But I just want to summarize a few things here, Johan, and just keep me real here, right?
Yep.
And then we'll kind of start to round off. So there's a couple of really key things that you are kind of pointing to, right? And in these last conversations, and one of them is really about understanding the different stakeholders, of course, and their interests, what's driving their interests, right? But then the next thing is kind of what I'm listening from you is, I think, one, anchoring some kind of a good price that you can work down from if needed, and then having what I would call a concession plan. We were talking about the different levers to pull, right? So
scope change.
Scope change. So,
that's very important.
Yeah, what's kind of like high value to them, but kind of less cost for me, which is the levers that Christopher you were talking about in.
And it's relatively frequent that some of the low value stuff is actually costing a lot from the vendor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
and I think this is very more common sense. But I think the most important takeaway, which is not so common sense, is that build on ideas, solutions, things that they have said.
Right.
And don't come with solutions yourself.
Right. It's very counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's very counterintuitive. It is.
Yeah.
And another thing which I have experienced is that if you have trained people in negotiation, so they know which mechanisms, what works and what doesn't work, how the theory works, it's much, much easier if you want to coach them.
Yeah.
Because if you haven't trained them, you have to start it all over again. And they will always do the same mistake. And they don't understand why those are mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to train people. That's, I think, one of the most crucial things.
Okay, so if you want to, so that's actually a great segue to the next point. So training people, if I want to become a better negotiator, what do I'm listening to this and I'm going, I need to learn this more. What do I do? Where do I go? What do I do?
I think you attend a course in it.
Yep. Okay. And you mean if they want to talk to you more about this stuff, where can they find you?
Yeah, they could find me. They could call me, I think, or email me. That's the best thing to do.
And where can they find your details?
Johan at Lagerbielkepartners.se.
Okay, excellent, cool. So one question we always ask in these podcasts before we end up is, obviously you've read the Megadeals book and we know that you like it and you recommend it. Is there any other book that's kind of really impacted you that you would like to recommend to the listeners?
Yeah, I think a really great book about negotiations is The Mind and Heart of the Negotiator, written by Lee Thompson. It's a good book with sort of a lot of psychological insights, and you also get a sort of idea how come we have come to those conclusions. They have come to those conclusions.
So one key principle behind the Megadeals podcast is that we continue to research the domain of Megadeals, which is vast and has a lot of adjacent areas. So
and spread that knowledge through the listeners.
Yeah, exactly. And actually doing that research live and recorded so people can listen to it, which is kind of the intention. So I have one question to you, John. So is there anyone or a few people that you can recommend that we should try to interview that could either be people from the vendor side that you've coached and that are really great at applying all your theories and practice knowledge, someone, a star on the purchasing side, like a purchasing department head or someone that Megadeals can learn from, or a more scientist around negotiation that we should really interview, or any other idea you have?
One idea I have, which I think is very interesting to understand this process perspective of what's going on between the parties. It's a former colleague of mine, a man called Anders Wendelheim, and he's an expert in group dynamics and organizational change.
Right.
And I've learned a lot from him about what's going on between people when they meet and sort of how do you change things. And I think that could be a very interesting person.
And change is a key part of Megadeals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he has a lot of insights and original insights in this. And he's both a researcher and he has sort of been a practitioner for 30 years or something like that.
Right.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Anyone from the purchasing side that you've coached that you think this person is brilliant, can share a lot of...
Yeah, I met a lot of brilliant person, but I can't really... I don't... In fact, I must say, I don't know exactly what they do with the knowledge I sort of try to bring them. But one guy who is very good at talking about purchasing and purchasing negotiation is a man called Siegfried Rytten. He has a lot of insights and experience from that field.
Okay.
And that's also an opening for you listeners, because we have the intention to interview a lineup of purchasing department heads, especially people that are buying Megadeals. I mean, not buying toothpaste, but buying Megadeals, because if we understand them better, it'll make the Megadeals discipline even better, basically. So please ping us on LinkedIn or go to megadeals.com and you'll find us there and mention a few names that you think we should really talk to. And ideally from anywhere in the world, etc.
Excellent. Johan, Christopher, thank you so much for today. And Johan, thank you for taking your time to come here. It's been really interesting listening to you. A lot of knowledge between those two ears. And thank you for sharing some of it with us today.
Stay tuned for the Megadeals negotiation webinar.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.